This episode is brought to you in part by Catchpoint. Catchpoint is an internet performance monitoring platform that gives you visibility into everything that impacts your applications from the end user's perspective.
Learn more at the break.
Packet pushers.
Welcome to Day 2 DevOps, where the dev oops is in the details. I'm Kyler Middleton, and on Day 2 DevOps, we explore those details and how you can learn from the mistakes of others and build a solid DevOps practice on day 1 and beyond. With me on this journey of learning and doing is my co-host, Ned Bellavance. Hi, Ned.
Howdy, Kyler. Today, we are talking about a bunch of different things. We start the conversation around serverless, where it is, where it's going, and how it started out really cloud specific, but has now changed a little bit. We also talked about how Rust is a very fast language for Lambda, and we might even see a little pushback in the comments on that one. And finally, how being a curious human is really the best kind of human.
I love that. Guiding us through all things serverless is our guest, Ben Pyle, a cloud architecture consultant who spent many years becoming an expert at serverless technologies, among many other things. I've been building a small serverless AI Slack bot myself, and I keep researching serverless, and I've run into Ben Pyle's writings and content and blog, and so I thought we need to get him on that show. Let's get him over here. And we did today. With no further ado, let's talk to Ben. Here he is. Welcome to the show, Ben. I saw you made the jump earlier this year to your own consulting gig. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
What do you focus on? What are you doing out there?
I'm doing a whole bunch of different things. For those of you who've made the jump before, it's like you have these visions of what you think you're going to do. And then if I look back 12 months later, I've done a whole bunch of the opposite of what I thought, but like it's been in the best way possible. I had somebody describe me as a white collar Uber driver, but for technical people. And it actually makes a ton of sense because if I think about all the stuff that I've worked on this year, it's everything from Kubernetes to serverless to content creation to helping companies early stage with CTO and architecture stuff. So I love variety. It's been a really good move. And I'm doing it with my wife. So she and I partnered together and she's a CPA and we're a family business. Our kids are homeschooled. Like our life is just so nicely centered that it's been a really good transition.
Wow. Now, I'm assuming you weren't a consultant prior to this. You did a lot of work in the industry.
I did.
So what was the background that brought you to this life of consulting?
So I've been doing this for 25 years. I started professionally programming in the mid to late 90s. I spent a little time in the 2000s doing some consulting work. So the variety has always been in my blood and in my veins. And so I was a CTO previously, 5.5 years at a healthcare EMR, so electronic medical record. I've spent time as an architect. I've been a developer. The only role I haven't done, which is why I have a ton of appreciation for it, is QA. And I always have a soft spot for quality engineers. And so, yeah, I've been a bunch of things. And so I love variety, like I mentioned earlier. And so being a consultant is a really good fit for where I'm at.
I was a consultant for 7 years and it's so varied, it's so interesting, and it's very intense as well.
It is.
You thought you knew a lot going in, and then you realize how little you know, but also how little anybody else knows.
Yeah, that's a really important point is that like you get in a room and sometimes you look through this glass and you're like, man, they have it all figured out. And then you go on that side of the glass and it's like, no, they don't. I just had a weird perception in my head. I know just as much or sometimes more than they do. And so it's been fun because this is a lifestyle business for me. Like there's a difference between want and needs, right? And so once I have what I need, I get to do a whole bunch of things that I want to do, which is really kind of more what's inspired it versus just trying to accumulate and accumulate. Life's short and there's more to it than writing code, even though I love writing code.
Absolutely. Got to work so you can live.
100%.
You talked about all the things you did. And right before we started recording, we were talking about the Phoenix Project and the Brent character who in this book, if you haven't read it, which you should, it's amazing. There is a Brent character that knows everything at this auto shop company. I think they manufacture.
Yeah, the auto parts. Yeah.
Yeah. And he does everything. Everyone goes to him to solve everything. And it leads to this sort of critical failure in the company because you need him to solve anything. And if he goes on break, which he's not permitted to, you can't fix the things.
No, you can't fix it.
That sounds hard. That sounds like a lot of things. How do you choose what to learn, how to learn when your scope is so broad? Kubernetes versus serverless versus databases, that's a lot.
That's really interesting question. So I have like a pattern. Like I will invest 90 days of like really intense learning, and then I take like a 90-day break. And so I go through these cycles. And so my wife will see like I still order textbook. When I was like 16, 17, 18, I got textbooks for Christmas because you couldn't get book. Internet really didn't have a ton of data. So I love books. And so my wife always knows that I'm in that cycle when like Amazon shows up with like that, and then I can start kind of reading and plowing through. But it's generally almost always about like the pursuit of solving a problem. For me, at least, I enjoy technology because it's like a canvas. I'm solving problems through creativity, and I'm not just learning to learn. I'm learning to help. So if I like the Kubernetes stuff I'm doing right now is to help a customer that's trying to do a migration from AWS ECS, and I've got some Kubernetes experience, but I was like, I can go through a cycle, spend some time learning, dig into it, and get my hands on it. And next thing you know, you're dropping things in production, and you're managing just like you had always been. So I don't know. Like I think after a while, some of it just kind of becomes the cycle. Like if you've been in tech for a long time, you just get used to it. And then I've also gotten good at knowing what I'm probably not going to be good at, which is like Next versus Vue versus React versus X, and Swift versus all the Flutter, all the different mobile and web stuff. I don't spend a ton of time out there. I've kind of given up the pursuit of needing to be like the notion of Brent is impossible. And I think that's the fallacy that people should take away from reading Brent is like maybe you could be Brent 15 years ago when you just started to put virtual machines into production and you were just dealing with like some VMs. Now the notion of Brent's impossible. There's too much debt. And I think you would harm yourself if you tried to be like mentally, it would just overburden yourself to try to get to the point of being Brent in today's world.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, totally agree. We had someone who was very like Brent when I worked at a university, JB. And
Mm-hmm.
JB knew everything there was to know about Solaris and the hardware it ran on
Oh,
and like all the older systems that were there.
uh-huh.
But like you said, as new technologies rolled out, he didn't have time or capacity to learn all these new things and all their minutia. So,
Nope.
I mean, he was critical whenever there was a sun issue. But when we started rolling out RHEL, it was suddenly, okay, well, now we got to talk to somebody else to fix the RHEL problem.
I think that's what happens. You're the second person this week that's mentioned Solaris and HPUX have come up in conversation.
It's still running out there, believe it or not.
hmm I tell this analogy when I work with other folks that if you build a castle and then build a moat around it, which is your skill set, right? Nobody can
Mhm.
approach my castle, my Solaris. That's great. You're probably the Solaris expert for a long time, especially if you don't teach anyone else how to do your thing. But technology moves, they're not just going to sit there and need Solaris forever. They're going to need the new thing. So, like,
Yep.
if you hand it off and teach it, you can learn the new thing. And if you don't, someone else is going to learn the new thing.
Yeah. There's a really weird movie from the 2000s, You, Me, and Dupree, which is line in this picture. I have a really visual memory. And Owen Wilson is sitting there with, I think it's Matt Dillon, and they're talking about like his Carlness. And it's like your name added with ness on the end of it. And it always struck me as like your value in your job is not your knowledge, because to your point, like as soon as somebody broaches that castle, like your knowledge is gone, like you have nothing. But what you have is who you are, like your uniqueness, your individual value at an organization, I think, and your ability to learn is way more important than what you currently know, right? Because that's going to change. It always will change. So
Wow.
I 100% agree with you.
Drawing inspiration from the strangest of places. I have heard the title. I have never seen that movie.
Good thing this isn't a film podcast, but it's not something you should like seek out and go watch. But there's this scene where in there in this restaurant, and that always sticks to my mind just because of the fact that he's pitching his friend up as being unique, and his uniqueness is and his individuality is what makes him valuable.
Wow.
I think is a really cool way to think about it.
I love that.
Yeah.
One of the things that you happen to know a lot about is serverless.
Yeah.
You had opinions about that on LinkedIn, which is, I think, how Kyler found you.
hmm
Yeah.
Where do you think we are with serverless today versus where we wanted to be?
Oh, the serverless to me is interesting. I'll start by tracing backwards. Like serverless wasn't founded by like some cool open source project, or wasn't founded by like some like Linus in his house building something up, right? It was almost vendor oriented,
Hmm.
right? Because you really can't have serverless without platforms. And so you've got to have some way to execute whatever it is you're doing. And so I don't know. To me, where I think serverless is now is to a point where it doesn't matter. Not that it doesn't matter that it's not important, just that it's kind of just become it's accepted. It's a viable way to run compute and to build applications just as straightforward as containers is another viable way to run and deploy things. And so I think it's reached a point where it's matured. It's not new, it's not novel, it's not unproven. Whether AWS, Microsoft, Google intended this is where it was, it would be really difficult for me to kind of forecast because I wasn't there. But for me personally, a lot of the platforms have matured to a point where I don't even think twice, and often will think about pulling for it first, depending upon requirements, people. Like there's so much that goes into it that's just beyond, I think any decision in technology is the people decision and a skill set decision.
Hmm.
So I think it's definitely a point where it's mainstream. I see arguments for and against it all the time, and I think they're kind of wasted because I think the argument's already been made. We're past it. Choose to use it or don't, like it or don't, but its existence or viability is not really debatable.
I saw a post that you made on LinkedIn. Like Ned said, that's how I ran into you. I just read,
Uh
I'm building a serverless project myself, and I ran into your name a lot. Thank you.
huh. You bet.
And I saw a post that you said 2025 is going to be the year of quality over quantity with serverless.
Hmm.
What does that mean? If we're already mature, where does quality go from here?
So again, I go back to this like vendor controls launch and community because again, everybody thinks of serverless as Lambda, right? Everybody thinks it's compute or Azure functions or whatever. And to me, compute is an aspect of serverless, but I don't believe that Lambda is any more serverless than, say, DynamoDB or any more than, say, Simple Queue Service and AWS. Those are all things that I don't care about infrastructure. I don't care about compute. They're ready to go with a single call. I get charged per consumption. It's all pretty standard at this point. But what I have seen kind of popping up, companies like Momento, who you see me probably write a good bit about, they're a
Mhm.
serverless cache. They've got caching, topics, webhooks, crazy ridiculous scale, which again, I pay for only what I use. Neon is another company that's doing stuff with Postgres databases. So I think that we'll start to see, and I could be totally wrong, but I hope that we start to see kind of quality individual purpose built vendors bringing tools together that we have choice, right? So like right now, if I want to do data in AWS and I want to be purely serverless, DynamoDB is pretty much the preferred way to go do that. I miss SQL. Like I like SQL. Like SQL is great. Like and a lot of projects need SQL. And so I know that SQL got dirty for a long time, but like it's still amazing and it's still really cool. And I would love to see more opportunities to do that. So for me, quality, I think, is watching these smaller vendors that are coming up, build incredible products on top of this. Like the greatest gift I think that AWS ever gave us was EC2 VPCs and this amazing amount of compute that just scales and collapses on demand. And I think you see other builders now building products that are going to be more higher quality because they're going to be very niche focused.
Totally. The cloud hyperscalers sure have an incentive here to make you want to scale out like that, like crazy. When in reality, most enterprises are pretty stable. Like you've deployed enough servers and you just run it. And like on your day two DevOps, you just run the thing and it's not bursty in the way that we were sold cloud, that you'll have these huge bursts. And like, I just don't see it outside of, I don't know, maybe retail in the holidays. I don't see it.
Absolutely. The other thing that I think is interesting is that there's this whole like Gen AI and AI buzz that's happening, right? Well, while everybody's focused over there, I think that there's space in the market to fill gaps where there are other products that could be stood up. Like I said, this caching product that's like completely serverless. Like that's an awesome niche. You could serve that market really, really well without having to deal with a Redis cluster and scaling and nothing about Redis. I love Redis. But if I didn't have to stand up another Redis cluster and then manage it, I'd be a-okay with that. Like I can live with that. So I do. I think there's a little bit of a window where other people will be able to fill some gaps that will move serverless forward, but more into a period of choice versus right now where I think we are. It's like, hey, I'm doing serverless. I'm AWS, I'm Azure, I'm GCP or whatever. I have to pick that cloud and then pick that version of serverless.
Right. The one thing I noticed is when you were talking about some of the newer serverless things out there, they weren't public cloud provider specific. They were exterior services that you could consume, I assume, from any cloud or even not from one of the major public clouds, correct?
Yes, correct. You could. And it's the same thing. If you think about serverless, to me, it's nothing to provision, nothing to manage, no scheduled downtimes, cost tracks usage, and ready to go with a single API call. Like it's a couple of like, to me, it's a categorization of a feature that it is or isn't serverless based on the attributes that it provides.
Mhm.
The ability just to hit it over a web endpoint with an API call, exactly. I could do it from my laptop. I could do it Azure. I could do it Cloudflare, wherever it is, right? I don't have to be in AWS to take advantage. And I think there's going to be some interesting things that pop up there, and you'll see these hybrids. Because again, I think choice is important. And I think that's kind of the next evolution of it, is that there becomes a little bit more independence in what we decide to build with. Because right now it has been very cloud focused. And to your point, which I love, like we don't always need that scale. Like hyper scale is not a problem that everybody has. And I would even argue that like whatever the word is less than hyper, like go like 3 levels down. And that's probably where people really are. I'm picturing ludicrous speed in my head. I had Spaceballs now in my head.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They've gone to plaid.
Yes,
We're not all going to plaid. Light speed is enough, you know?
Mm-hmm.
The serverless difference from cloud is an interesting thread to pull on. I have this project that I've been building myself, and I built it in Lambda, and it's Python, and it uses Azure AI to respond to like Slack requests. And I pitched it to another architect, and he was like, why did you build the serverless part in AWS and the AI part in Azure? And I was like, I don't want to build a function app. Like, I don't understand. I know how Lambdas work. I don't understand how function apps work.
Right.
And so he said, you can move one or the other. You got to pick a cloud. And so we're talking a Bedrock today, because I don't want to convert everything to function apps.
No, I know.
Is that what you see? Do you see people kind of committed to like, I know serverless in AWS only, or like how much overlap do you see? Yeah.
Honestly, not a ton. If I'm building something serverless, I'm going AWS because I know it better than the others. I don't see a ton of portability. And I think that's where people get really wrapped around the axle, is the whole vendor lock-in. You know, the minute you wrote that first like Maven, POM file, you're locked into Java. Like, I mean, you're going to lock in at some point, right? Like it's where you want to lock in, and where you're comfortable locking in is really the question. It's not, am I going to get locked in? It's at what level in the stack do I want to get locked in? I could probably also say, if you're really worried about portability, containers are a really good way to build things. And you can run Lambda containers. You can run containers in a bunch of ways in Azure. I think that Azure container apps or app containers are a really great way to do it. You could, again, take your container, bond to the event that's coming in, and you've got a lot more portability there, if that's really what you're concerned about. But then I would say the minute you hook it up to a queue or to a Bedrock or Azure AI, you're like locked in that direction. So like, where's the level of lock-in? And it's hard to argue with the 85% of undifferentiated heavy lifting. Like if you want to do the lift yourself, you can, right? 100% can do it. People want things now and fast and cheap and always on. And it takes more people and takes more time. And so I just kind of embrace the lock-in and find ways that I can to be as comfortable with parts of it as I'm able to. But I don't see a lot of like, I do serverless in 4 different flavors. You usually find like serverless devs in Azure versus AWS or versus GCP.
Right. I think what you said earlier on in the conversation about how serverless kind of came out of the vendors, so it was very vendor specific. It didn't start with an open standard that was an open source project that everyone could embrace. It's sort of like the antithesis of Kubernetes, which like that started vendor agnostic to a certain degree. So it was able to be incorporated into all these different platforms. Not totally portable. I can't just lift up my exact same manifest and drop it in another service, but it's close, much closer than serverless.
Oh, gotcha. I mean, much, much closer. And I think you even see this a little bit in the community space. And so I'm a big part of a community called Believe in Serverless. It's a Discord channel, and there's thousands of members that are in there now. It's a really, really cool community for people that are interested in serverless, and from all different levels of like new person to 10 years or whatever. And I think what you find even in the community side is that it's been very vendor agnostic as well, versus so easy to get like CNCF and get like Kubernetes people together. Like they speak the same language across the board, right? You're talking about YAML and resource definitions and all this stuff and all the different parts of it. Serverless doesn't. Like if I'm doing Lambda and you're doing Azure Functions, we talk here, but we're not talking lower level the same, right? Because it's got this level of abstraction on top of it. And so I even think community gets fractured, but I'm liking what I'm seeing with this kind of more inclusive community. And I mean inclusive from all clouds, really talking about conceptually how to process things in a serverless way versus, trying to, hey, we're talking to AWS. I think you find a lot of like serverless curious people too. Like if you're in AWS, they're always kind of wondering like, what are those Azure people doing over there? And they're kind of poking around a little bit. And so when you see them all mixing together, because generally like serverless devs and serverless engineers are hanging out with people in their cloud. When you put them together, you get really interesting thought that I think you don't always get from like a very homogenous Kubernetes group, because they're all talking Kubernetes. Serverless, they're talking all these different clouds and all these different options, configurations. Serverless curious is an interesting way to think about it, because they're always wondering,
We need
Yeah.
a flag. We need like an LGBTQ flag for like serverless curious.
There you go. I think that's people that are just wondering what's over on that side of the wall over there.
Ah.
So that's definitely the case.
I've been hearing about D-SQL, and I don't know what it is, but I have heard from several very smart folks that it is the announcement this year. So for anyone that hasn't
Yes.
caught up on that, what is D-SQL and how big of an announcement is it? So, Ned, our app is down.
Oh no, no one can listen to us ramble on. I mean, pontificate about important tech things. But wait, our health checker shows all services are started.
I guess the app is up, but our users can't get to it, which brings up a great philosophical question. Is the app still up if no one can reach it?
Hmm. If a podcast falls in the forest, does anyone hear it stream? Maybe we can talk about this after bringing the app back up.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
How did you even know it was down?
Catchpoint, our internet performance monitor, is showing our app isn't reachable from where our listeners are.
Well, that is a problem, yeah. We could have kept screaming into the void and never have known.
And you, dear listener, don't have to scream into the void alone either. Catchpoint is observability for your internet stack, just like application performance monitoring is observability for your application stack.
And they do it with telemetry from their large, diverse observability network.
If that sounds useful to you, check them out on catchpoint.com/DevOps. And thanks to Catchpoint for saving the show today. Now back to the episode.
D-SQL. So basically distributed SQL, I think is what it stands for and what the AWS team has been able to do. And so, AWS has lots of flavors of ways to run SQL, whether it's an RDS and relational database service, or whether it's an Aurora, which talks about Aurora with serverless version, right? And I put that in air quotes because this kind of gets to be the sticking point for serverless developers. Because one of the things that's really important in a serverless service is that it scales to zero. If I'm not using it 2 in the morning, but I'm still paying for it, is it still serverless, right? Some people will say it's like sort of serverless. And I think that for years, vendors have tried to go, look, and I get it. Building something that can scale pretty much instantly, can be operational in milliseconds, and then collapse to nothing is a really hard task. Like, I mean, I'm not the world's greatest engineer, and that just sounds really hard to me. So, like, if I was going to go build that, like, I think a lot of times it's almost kind of like, again, I love analogies. It's like my kids cleaning their room. Like, it's clean enough, right? Like, they've almost got it clean. It's almost serverless. Can we pass this off as serverless? And some people will say yes. Some people will be like, nope, it doesn't scale to zero. And so D-SQL is supposed to scale to zero, and from a cost standpoint. So you get a Postgres compliant, and again, compliant meaning that it covers a large array of the Postgres features, one that's already kind of out the door that kind of hack people off. So there's no foreign key support, which, I'm a programmer. I don't really care about foreign keys. I do that in my code, but like database people care a ton about foreign. But it scales to zero. It also expands with capacity. I believe it can be multi-region, so it can be, you've got some redundancy built into it. And my initial test with it, I threw, I want to say, a few 100,000 requests against 100,000 plus size table, and I was getting single digit milliseconds on index queries, which is fantastic because I'm only going to run this when I want it, and when I don't run it, it's not being consumed. So it's back to my whole thing that I think we pushed NoSQL too far. And I think we did that in order to have truly serverless builds. And I think people reached for DynamoDB and its amazing, amazing ability to hyperscale, which most people, again, don't have, when all I needed was just a SQL database, but I didn't want to pay the $32 a month to run a SQL database in RDS when my functions only cost me like 2 cents or not even a cent sometimes. So you have this out of whack cost. So I think D-SQL will bring that cost back in. I think it'll make SQL really interesting again for serverless developers in AWS. And I think it was really, really difficult for them to pull off, which is probably why it took them a few years to get there.
So this is the SQL renaissance coming in 2025. That sounds interesting.
That's what I'm hoping for, is that SQL's coming back. And some would say it never left, but I think it's coming back, especially in the serverless world.
I remember when NoSQL was a real big thing and everyone was like anti RD relational databases and like, no, we don't need all that extra garbage. We just,
Oh, yeah.
And maybe sometimes you do.
Yes.
Maybe sometimes you do.
Yes. To me, it's with anything. And the cloud is, the options that you have are so vast that I think it makes the role of the architect even that much more important. And it makes the developer's job that much more difficult because you're having to ask questions like, how might this perform? What are the use cases? What load might I see? And it's not just, hey, give me 6 in a rack. Now it's become like, which service do I pick? Do I want it all the way on? How much can it cost? What are the options? And it just becomes very difficult. And so I think if they bring a scale to zero SQL and it does its job, I think you'll see a shrinking bit of NoSQL moving back towards SQL in some of these use cases, which I'm happy about. Like I said, I love SQL.
I'm glad you do, because I am notoriously terrible with SQL.
Well, I mean, here's the other thing too, and it's kind of funny. And again, like you generationally, if you never worked in or you don't remember VMs and you've never installed and compiled your own Linux system and you didn't learn Bash and didn't learn any of the shell scripting, if you didn't invest in those skills or you never learned those skills, right? Like these abstractions are super helpful. But I was telling somebody the other day who's probably 15, 16 years younger than me, I spent a lot of time acquiring these skills that I still use Vim. Like I really like terminal-based development and I like my SQL from the 90s. And so I'm happy to see it back because I think that there's definitely a need for some of these skills that are still out there.
Yeah, I came from before VMware was really a thing.
Yeah.
I have that prior knowledge, but anybody walking into an ops role today, the chances that they've had to like rack a server and cable it up, not so much.
Pretty low. Pretty low.
We've been watching Blue Sky grow like crazy. And I saw a post from one of their engineers that said, like, we're scaling as fast as we can. The servers are in the mail. And I thought, I haven't heard that sentence in like 10 years.
Yes, I find it fascinating. But again, like you go back to some of these really, really large companies, then don't even go cloud. They do what they would prefer. If your app is built in a way that you just need commodity hardware and you feel comfortable about it, you don't have a ton of variety, probably makes still a boatload of sense. Definitely gonna be cheaper.
Way cheaper. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. From a pure cost. I don't know about from a people standpoint, but from a cost standpoint, it's definitely cheaper.
People tend to be the most expensive thing until they're not.
You're correct.
And if you hit that hyperscale growth curve where you don't necessarily need 20 or 30 more people, but you need like 1,000 or 2,000 more servers, then yeah, suddenly the most expensive thing in your company is your cloud bill. And then it's time to kind of turn your focus towards that.
Yes, absolutely right.
Talking about foundational skills, I use this metaphor a lot, so much so that Ned has mocked up an image of it, that cloud and a lot of these technologies, all these abstractions, are a lot of foundational skills, which I call raccoons in a trench coat. And they just show you the trench coat, you know, the like, it looks like a grown-up software, and it's really not. It's Vim and Python, and it's all wrapped together. And if you have those foundational skills, you can build anything. So I agree. You start from the bottom, start from learning Vim and networking and really simple stuff, and you can build anything complicated.
Yeah, and it's going to pay you dividends if you're in your career and you're having to troubleshoot this stuff. And until a computer can talk to another computer to describe what it wants and build it to meet a customer's needs, there's always going to be human in the middle. And the lower you are in that stack, the better suited you're going to be. It doesn't mean you have to live in that stack, but the more you understand it, the better programmer, the better ops person you're going to be from a cloud standpoint. The raccoons thing, I'm picturing the raccoon like stepping out from behind like the garbage can, like just stretching his arms and legs out. Like it's totally true. I'm going to use that analogy. I will give you credit for it, but I like that one a lot.
Occasionally I use an analogy that I think is really popular, and Ned gives me the look and I know, oh no, that's a country analogy that I let slip out.
I'm from Texas and originally Louisiana, so I like the raccoon in a trench coat. I get that. That hits me right here.
There I am, the city boy.
You would have maybe rats in a trench coat. I don't know.
Pigeons, something with pigeons.
Pigeons with a top hat.
Yeah. No, I think rats really do form the foundation of everything. So, but they're not fancy enough for trench coats.
Well, it could be like in a kimono, like Splinter from the old Ninja Turtles.
I would not be angry about that.
Yes.
Pigeons in a kimono, that could be the analogy going forward.
I don't even know what that would mean.
I don't either, but it sounds awesome.
I saw other posts from you talking about Lambda serverless running Rust. And in my opinion, like Lambda and all of these serverless things, they're just totally language independent. Like they're unlinked to performance. It just runs the code and then it shuts down. Who cares?
Sure.
But the post that you wrote was about how Rust can make Lambda work much faster and efficient and launch faster. And like, I don't understand what that means at all. Why is Rust in particular like the best, and why?
Ooh, so all of my serverless friends would say you just stepped in it because you mentioned Rust and Lambda, which means that I'm probably going to have like this like pontification moment for like 20 minutes. But no, I actually just gave a talk 3 weeks ago at QCon about Rust and Lambda. I was kind of juxtaposed against some other Rustaceans who have a significant amount of experience, like 10, 12 years of Rust, coming from like a systems background and like a C++ replacement. I haven't written C++ since like 1999. So it's been quite a while since I've been without a garbage collector, which Rust doesn't have. And so I got into Rust from really like a personal challenge. Like I was writing Go at the time and I'd kind of seen Rust and it was like, this looks really interesting. There's no garbage collector. So it's this whole borrow checker, ownership. Like this all seems pretty foreign and hard. I like climbing mountains, like metaphorically. So I was like, I got to go check this out. So I started working with Rust and started noticing, like, first and foremost, like the language is super interesting. I find I write fewer defects with it. I find that I don't have exceptions as much in it. I find that the compiler is very pedantic and is very particular, which kind of like will catch me ahead of time. But then you look at performance and it's ridiculous, the performance that you get out of it, like orders of magnitude ridiculous. So I was comparing and making this argument at this talk about like compare it to like popular Node.js, like just a TypeScript project. And Rust will give you between 10 and 14% better performance.
Wow.
Lambda suffers from cold starts. If you read the internet says cold starts the worst thing ever. Happens all the time. AWS says I think it happens like 3%. So cold starts can take anywhere between like a couple hundred milliseconds to like 1.2, 1.4, depending upon your language. Rust takes exactly like 14 milliseconds. Like
Wow.
there's no cold start time. So this is like the initialization process. This is dropping your code and executing it. And so the argument that I like to make is that if you're just running a hobby project and your function gets run 100 times a month or 100 times a day, you're not going to see anything of any significance. But if you take a function that's running 1,000 times a second with like a large load or something along that lines, you could see thousands of dollars of difference between Rust and TypeScript. And you could see between Rust and Python. And so if you remember, like cost follows usage in the serverless compute world, why would I not want to pick the thing that allows me to possibly not have to pivot to containers? Because I get good cost benefit. I don't have to endure load balancers and pods and definitions and all of this, but I can still get good value out of my functions by doing it in Rust. And so 2024 is my year that I wanted to push the serverless and Rust narrative. Feel like I'm making some headway. And in 2025, I'm doubling down. So I'm going to do more Rust and serverless content because I think that it's an amazing language that if you wanted to learn it, writing Lambda functions is the perfect place to get started. That's probably really, really, really opinionated, but I feel like it's a really good spot to do it.
I have been Rust curious for a little while now. And see, now we're curious about all kinds of things
Yeah.
today.
I just feel like we're technologists at this point. Like, I mean, like we are constantly like, ooh, something shiny. I got to know what that's all about over there.
It's dangerous. I can get distracted very easily.
Mhm.
That would be a really interesting way to learn Rust. What I was actually thinking about doing is I signed up for like the pro level of Chat GPT, and I was going to have Chat GPT teach me Rust as like an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I could throw an additional thing in there and be like, Chat GPT, I want you to teach me Rust with Lambda and see how far it can get me.
I don't know. I've only actually used the Chat GPT prompt once because I was forced to last week on a call. So I don't use like any AI at all in my day-to-day life. And so I'd be curious to see how far you get. Like, does it have enough knowledge about this space to get you there? Because I know that I'm not alone. I know several people that have learned Rust through using Lambda. Like I said, it'll give you all the benefits or a lot of the benefits of the language and its performance without having to deal with some of the parts that are a little bit ugly. But those ugly parts, once you learn them, are actually kind of beautiful. They just look really ugly on the surface.
There's a life lesson there, I'm pretty sure.
There is. There probably is. I'm in dad mode at the moment. There's a life lesson.
Yeah.
I've got a really basic, silly question. I just haven't had to solve this before. So Ned and I both write a great deal of Go. Ned's quality is quite a bit better than mine. And I have never had to put it inside a Lambda because it's a compiled code. So I wouldn't want to like have the code compile as part of the Lambda because you're racing against time every time you run a Lambda, right?
Yes.
So how do you generally solve that when you need to run a compiled language from Lambda? What do you do with artifacts?
It's kind of confusing because you see these runtimes, right? If you go pick a Lambda and it says, oh, Node.js or Ruby or .NET, and you're like, oh, those poor languages, they need something to run their code for them. And you're like, I have Go. I don't need something to run my code. It runs. It's natively compiled, right? So what you do is you end up choosing the Amazon Linux runtime. So there's an Amazon Linux 2023. It's a bare metal Linux runtime. It can run on ARM or it can run x86. When you build your Lambda function, I would always use something like CDK, which is the cloud development kit, or I would use SAM, which is the serverless application model. Those two frameworks from AWS will know how to compile and package a Go Lambda. And so your Lambda just gets compiled to a binary, put into a zip archive, gets uploaded to S3, then gets injected into your Lambda. And if it's running on AL2023, your code just launches in Linux just like it would running 100% normal. And so Rust is the exact same way. You build your binary and it'll run just like it had a runtime, but it doesn't need one, right? Because it was compiled for that chip. So Go and Lambda is like the perfect sweet spot, right? Because Go gives you all the beauty of like this compiled language that is highly performant, but it's also super simple. To me, Go feels like a compiled and improved TypeScript in a lot of ways. But you get the benefits of having it compiled. So you have faster cold start, better performance long term, but then you get the good rich Go experience. I have a bunch of examples on my blog that you can dig into. Like there's a ton of stuff.
I do find that Go's binaries that it produces are fairly larger than I might expect.
Huh. Interesting. I wonder if that's because it's got the garbage collection and everything built into it. Lightweight, but it still might be a little heavier.
Yeah, I mean, not something as ridiculous like Node.js, where it's not compiled and it's megs and megs and megs of other libraries and stuff. But yeah, still, it does tend to be a little heavier than I would expect if I was writing it in something like C.
Well, yeah, of course. And even with Rust, you'll get pretty tiny. I've never done a comparison binary size, but I'll get like low single digit meg lambdas in Rust. And I might get like 8, 10, 12 right out of Go, which does feel a little bit heavier. But it's not like the node stuff where your node modules directory feels like your junk drawer. Not quite sure what's in there, but you think you need all of it.
Absolutely.
Probably.
All the node people are going to start crazy hate at me on the internet now.
I feel like we've started a war with Go and Rust and all the other people that disagree with that. So in case they want to write any letters to you, where can they find you on the internet and learn more from you?
You can find me. I'm on LinkedIn, Benjamen Pyle, spelled with an E, not an I. It's really strange. I can thank my parents from 45 years ago. And I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky, same handle, Benjamen Pyle. I'm out there writing. And then I've got a blog called binaryheap.com where I produce all my content, all my different rants, musings, and tutorials. And then you can find my GitHub repo as well. There's tons of examples of lots of Rust, a good bit of Go, and a bunch of AWS code.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, send me all your hate mail and fun mail. It's totally fine. I'm good with it. If you've got opinions, I'd love to hear them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for appearing on Day 2 DevOps, and virtual high fives to you, dear listener, for tuning in. If you have suggestions for future shows, we would love to hear them. Really, we would. Hit either of us up on LinkedIn or send your feedback via packetpushers.net/FU. It stands for follow-up, I promise. You can find me, Kyler Middleton, blogging over on letsdodevops.com, and my stupendous co-host, Ned Bellavance, at nedinthecloud.com. We're both very terminally active on LinkedIn. Stop by and say hello. And if you have got a very cool cloud product you want to share with our audience of IT professionals, become a Day 2 DevOps sponsor. You'll reach several thousand listeners, all of whom have problems to solve. Maybe your product fixes their problem, but you'll never know unless you tell them about your amazing solution. Find out more at packetpushers.net/sponsorship. Until next time, just remember that doing DevOps is awesome, and so are you.